Hello, everyone. My name is Pamela Lopez, but please call me Z. I am the Program Director of Green Space Miami. Thank you all for joining us today, where we will be in conversation with Alma Leiva, one of the Green Space Miami Inaugural Initiative awardees. Green Space Miami, whose mission is to be a catalyst for action through community partnership and collaboration, is the Green Family Foundation's new community art space, guided by the Foundation's principles of inclusion, community empowerment, and education. We are dedicated to providing a platform for local artists and the community leaders doing the work alongside them. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing 4 phenomenal individuals who will join us in conversation. Alma Leiva, an Honduran-born multidisciplinary artist who received an MFA from Virginia Commonwealth University and a BFA from New World School of the Arts. Alma has exhibited her work in museums and galleries across the United States, in Europe and Latin America. She's completed residencies such as the MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, and Southern Constellations. Her work has been featured in numerous publications, including Time Magazine's, Lightbox, Photo District News, the Huffington Post, El Nuevo Herald, the Miami Herald, Art Pulse Magazine, Oxford, and that's just to name a few. Leiva currently lives and works in Miami, Florida. We also have joining us today is Jason Fronczek, who is a father, an artist, and a photographer, and has recently established his professional artistic practice at his home-based studio in Sanford, Florida, where he currently resides with his son. Since 2019, Jason has worked as an art instructor and program coordinator for the Florida Prison Education Project, a UCF initiative to bring college-level education into the prisons to give incarcerated persons a better chance on release. As an artist, Jason combines photography, mixed media, and installation to explore the dualities inherent in the relationship between art, memory, and culture, specifically as they relate to the invisibility and the stigma surrounding mass incarceration and mental illness. Jason's art asks viewers to slow down and take notice of the often unseen, overlooked, and discarded. We also have joining us is Mike Ster, a displaced land shark awaiting his triumphant return to the life-sustaining elements of sun, sand, and Atlantic Ocean saltwater, his natural habitat. Although he does proclaim that Caribbean or Gulf Coast waters could also suffice. Mike is a father, a writer, and a consumer of vast quantities of music. Mike's aim in life is to be an educator and a steward and guardian of the South Florida and Caribbean coastal habitats. He lives by the words, vive apasionadamente, live passionately. He is a current participant of the Exchange for Change. And our moderator, Kathie Klarreich, is the founder and executive director of Exchange for Change, a Miami-based prison writing nonprofit which launched in 2014. She did so after a 24-year career as a journalist, half of which was spent in Haiti reporting for print, radio, and television, including Time, the New York Times, ABC, and NPR. She is the author of Madame Dread, A Tale of Love, Voodoo, and Civil Strife in Haiti, and a contributor to 2 anthologies titled So Spoke the Earth and Women, Writing, and Prison. Kathie started facilitating writing workshops in the correctional systems in 2009 and began the writing exchanges with academic institutions in 2013. She got her BA from the University of Michigan and her MFA from Lesley University. Please note that this evening's talk was pre-recorded so that we can include Mike's response, who is currently in a state facility. The audio that will play when we turn on to his responses, however, is Mike's voice. Kathie, it is my honor to turn this pertinent conversation over to you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm so excited. This has been a long time in coming, and I'm just absolutely thrilled to have Alma and Jason with us and having had the opportunity to work with Mike, who obviously regrets that he's not here in person. So the way we're going to set this up is we've got a couple questions. I'll ask the questions, then we'll play Mike's pre-recorded response, and then Alma and Jason will have a chance to respond and then respond to each other to keep this as a current dialogue. So the first point, art is the conversation today, but how we perceive it and how we represent it is not universal. It's personal and it's intimate. The filters through which we inhale it have as much to do with our own history and experiences as they do with our emotional IQ. Without that emotional response, what we're looking at is really just an object. Students in a room, viewers in a museum, a crowd at an event, may appear to be moving in a migratory pattern, but actually it's just a sea of individuals. Alma, from what I can tell from your pieces, you translate your love and empathy for your home environment into art. And Jason, you incorporated your incarcerated experience, but as you've said in previous conversations, it's not the thing that you want to define you. And Mike is constantly reevaluating what he looks at and his emotional response to creativity in the same way he evaluates his relationship to the amount of time he served and has left. We're going to have all three of you talk a little bit about the creative process and how consciously or unconsciously you fold your history and emotions into your work and what you hope the audience takes away from those pieces after viewing them. So we'll start off with a pre-recorded response from Mike to that question of the conscious or unconscious way he folds his history and emotions into his work and what he hopes the audience takes away from those pieces after viewing them.
My creativity almost always begins when something I have experienced or witnessed causes me to feel a bit off kilter. It can be a slight uneasiness or a major agitation. It can be a new trigger to an old experience or a novel event that leaves me unsettled. Whatever it is, when it begins to disturb the quiet space of my mind or the visceral tomb of my emotions, I know I have to find some creative outlet for it. Like a gust of wind to a flame, the experience fires up a call to activity. I must find a way to illuminate the world in a unique way. A necessity like breathing air. St. Thomas Logan said, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." St. Thomas's words speak directly to my creative, emotional epicenter. I cannot detach my necessity to create, author something from nothing, begin inventing with my hands, or create whatever provoked me to make art in the first place, from my emotions. I'm emotional like that. My aim is to create enough emotional intensity that you move like a surge of energy through the ocean, creating your own waves of thought or emotion. Alma created those ups and downs for me in one of her Selvas pieces. The one with the indistinct shadow on the wall. A piñata and helium-less balloon lay lifeless on the floor. The shadow is particularly startling to me as it reminds me of images I saw decades ago of excavated huts from the city of Pompeii. When Italy's Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, heated mud and ash engulfed Pompeii, and people were incinerated as lava flowed into their homes. The excavation of some homes revealed no human remains, just their shadows emblazoned onto the surface where they died. While lava is not an invisible enemy like COVID-19, there was nowhere to hide. The shadow is a life, and life is what is missing from this art. It's startling. For me, that is just one aspect of how Alma's work explains the world in a unique way. As an artist, what people take away is tough to hope for. I always hope that what I create has shelf life and that it will cause someone to examine within themselves what the point was and what to do about it. I hope that the quiet of your mind has been awakened. I hope that there is an emotional response that leads to action. Perhaps you would be forced, inspired even, to bring forth your own explanation of the world, a poem, a narrative, a piece of your own art, because if you didn't, it may destroy you. My deepest hope is that my art becomes a billowy gust of wind that fans the flame of your own fire. Just as a master shipbuilder does not give people an admiration for fine craftsmanship, but a passion for the sea, so be it that my art would do the same, drive a passion for something greater than the art itself.
So that was Mike's response to that first question. And Alma, I think I'll kick it over to you, particularly because he referenced some of your pieces. So to talk a little bit about what Mike had to say, but also the initial question.
Yes, I think he was referring to Zelda number 6, which is Zeldas is a series I started working on in 2009, a few months before the military coup in Honduras. And that specific piece, I I started to think about, having recently moved to Virginia to pursue a master's degree. There were a lot of sort of like experiences that came into the work. My experience of feeling isolated from my family, from my immediate environment, and then what was going on later on in Honduras. Sort of like I started fitting all these factors into the work. For the first time, I felt like a real immigrant, because growing up in Miami, there was always Spanish, spoken everywhere. It has a large Latino community. The food, everything in the city, sort of like helped me, sort of like bridge that change from like living in Honduras and then coming here to the United States. So I started to experience what it was really to experience that trauma, like I think in a little bit more dramatic way when I moved to Virginia. And then I started to work on this series as a way of like trying to mine the psychological trauma of displacement. And so I started to incorporate elements from my immediate environment and bringing in elements to sort of like solicit a lived experience that was very specific to Hondurans or Central Americans. But then as I work on this body of this new project, I started to see a lot of like things that connected this very personal experience that was for me at the time with the history of U.S. Policy in Central America. And when the military coup took place in 2009, I decided to travel to the country to document, to research what was going on at the time. And so I started interviewing civilians, photographing the way people build their homes, that were pretty much like prisons, So then I started to fit more into the work, and then I completed another series of work called Outside the Cell. So basically you would see like the way these structures, the way people build their homes with bars. And also a very interesting thing about the series is like, and very interesting to me fact was that I was always interviewing people through bars. So in cell number 6, just to go back to the work, so I started to see all these sort of like threads that connected those histories, U.S. foreign policy in Central America, and also how people, the civilians, citizens live there, pretty much siege to fear, learning to live with it, and creating this domestic space that encapsulates the violence outside. For example, with the celda number 6, the piñata on the floor, it's a metaphor for the actual violence, where the confetti is all over the floor, as a metaphor for the blood, for the bloodshed. And this was actually inspired by an actual case in these installations, which I construct all over the country, and then document using a medium format camera, and finally select one image as the final piece. So basically, what I became really interested in is to start bringing little pieces of actual information, of documentation of actual victims of violence in the country. So this one was informed by a murder involving 2 children, and the father and the mother that were lost to narco violence in Honduras, which was something that became more prevalent, and that became something that started to behold the country after the military coup. So yes.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, thank you everyone for having me here. It's such an honor to be here today. Well, I've been formed and inspired by my past. My future is mine to create, both personally and artistically. I love this concept of an emotional IQ, and I've recently learned a few things about myself. At 50 years old, mind you, I've been reflecting a lot on my work and talking to many people about the emotions that certain works have elicited. My 5 pieces in the series, the silver linings, breaking the clouds, specifically, those are the 5 images. One is the centerpiece of my son. Those are my literal translations of taking a physical object from my life of an experience and turning it into a piece of art to release. The question, how I perceive or how we perceive and how I represent, no, it's not universal. It's very personal because my experience, while relatable, was not experienced by anybody but myself. So I created this series, these 2 series, companion pieces, using court documents. I blew them up, oversized them, I overlaid them, I redacted information, I put imagery behind it to give a sense that it's looking out from behind this veil of system impactedness. Mike's experience right now is incarcerated. My former experience is born of incarceration, of being system impacted, of being institutionalized in many different aspects. This is one of them. You're looking at an object that is a communication device. The first thing I tell my students when we go in is art is not the object. Art is the conversation that can be had around this object to bring a better understanding of where we can go and separate ourselves from the trauma. This is a high trauma experience for myself, for my son, for anybody who goes through it. Really, it is a high trauma experience, and how you process that, how you get through that, how you get through the emotions is how you can have the conversation with somebody else. Let me rephrase that. The conversation that I have is non-audible. It's a visual experience. It's an emotional experience. To rewind, my long custody battle, which occurred over my son, is about getting through, breaking through the cloud. The cloud is the trauma. It's about how we get to where we're going. It's about enjoying the moment and trying to just create a new future for ourselves. I can use my past to create my future. So with my son's piece, I chose to feature an early portrait buried under the text. He's looking straight out. When I have these set up, they're directly across from each other. He's directly across from me, looking into me for guidance. So these 2 pieces talk to each other while you're experiencing them. It's talking to you about how to get through this trauma. So this is my history of experience. This is an emotional response born from my trauma. This is an object. It is all of these things. But to you, the viewer, it's an insight into this trauma.
Jason, maybe let me jump in here for a second and take something that you said and take something that Alma said, because I think it's a really interesting juxtaposition. So you talked about taking a physical object and turning it into art. And from what I can tell in Alma's pieces, she's creating art from the physical objects. And so it's a different way of approaching telling a story. So I wondered if the 2 of you might want to comment on that.
As far as going over and looking and reviewing Alma's work, I really love the sense of space that she creates. She's creating a space that doesn't belong and forcing you into it.
A lot of people have asked me about why the title Prison Cells, and I think I use the sort of like square format in my camera as a sort of like a small window for people to peek into this reality. And so by creating these installations that are very ephemeral, I just I create these spaces just for the camera, and then they're taken down. And so that's like the only really like evidence of like the of the installation. And so I was very interested in creating that, and then like by incorporating all these elements and in a way to like sort of like lead people to sort of like make meaning out of all the elements within the work. And I have had responses from people that come from like regions that experience similar issues such as violence, displacement, and Central Americans themselves. It seems like they have a different reading than, for example, people that have no similar experiences or that have not lived in the region. But yeah, the work comes from a very intimate and personal space inside of myself, of a lived experience. But that nonetheless is sort of like we've seen this sort of collective histories. As far as I wanted to detach myself from that in the beginning, it ended up coming to that because he talks about all these stories, these all these things that people begin to recognize within the work. And yes, so as much as in the beginning I wanted to stay away from the political, it eventually became very political. And of course I become more invested in the research, and then I thought this is actually very important for me to talk about these things. And Zelda number 10, for example, which is the one that we were looking at right now, which is a seesaw with a tourniquet, I became really interested in creating a sort of like this element that almost has like anthropomorphic qualities to it. And that for me was encapsulating what being a child means in the country. Always the trauma, represented in the tourniquet and the chipped wood, the children age earlier because of the violence, and yet they continue to be children. The violence seeping into the domestic space, the private space, by bringing in these outdoors elements within the space. And also, like for example, here you see some writing on the elements that I use. Cardboard, which you are going to see in a lot of my installations. Fabrics are elements that sort of like recall that ephemeral nature of the work, almost like not as steady, like it's sort of like verging on collapsing structures. And so within the work, I became really interested in bringing elements, for example, of like Mayan culture, the history of the Mayan culture in Honduras, that has become merely just a decoration. Going back to Zelda number 10, that's the Mayan god of death that relates to children. And then the elements that I incorporated, I actually produced this piece when I was at Atlantic Center for the Arts, when I was doing a residency with Pepón Osorio, who is one of the artists a very important influence in my work, Puerto Rican artist Pepón Osorio. And then I incorporate elements of Catholic iconography, a lot of fun objects that I brought into the space from the residency. And then, for example, on the there's like some text here on the cardboard on the wall, one of the walls, that says, "Honduras, where life is hard and funerals are free." Literally translates from like Honduras, donde la vida es dura y los funerales son gratis, which is a platform that this politician running for mayor of Tegucigalpa used to attract the vote of the citizens. So I always try to incorporate elements like that from my research into the work, and to sort of like bring to light how people become so used to the violence and to living with death every day.
So that's great, Alma. That sort of segues into my second question. And I don't want to be presumptuous, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect that the two of you and Mike, you have some idea of what you want to convey when you first start working on a piece, but then as the piece evolves, I imagine your initial idea also involves in unexpected ways. So you started to talk a little bit about the research and the emotional distance and intimacy you need that's connected to the evolution of your idea. So, Alma, you talked about the state of violence in your home country in the 1980s and feeling that you haven't, or the situation hasn't moved that much in 40 years. And Jason, you've talked about learning to live with dysfunction in a carceral setting, and now that you're out in the free world. And Mike is still adapting to the restrictions and challenges that he has in carceral spaces imposed on him that he needs to free himself from in order to create. So how do we address society about normalizing something that is not normal? How do you create a space that defies what has become the status quo, produced from being placed in a state of survival, which is not a true or whole representation or who we are as mankind? So we'll listen to Mike's response first, and then maybe Jason, you can respond to the question, and we'll kick it back to Alma.
Because art is provoked from within me in unexpected ways, I tend to assume its transformations will continue in unexpected ways. Once I'm provoked to create art, and before I begin writing, capturing, or creating, I attempt to better understand my subject matter, whatever it may be, so I can properly convey purpose or meaning through my own unique voice. Beginning with the end in mind, and knowing what I want to communicate is important to the progression and evolution of my work. My initial thoughts, notes, and research are a blueprint that gives me direction and a starting point, the foundation. I do realize blueprint sounds pretty rigid, and I don't mean it in a set-in-stone kind of way. It's conceptual, like how a word can be a virtue. It's not limited to a definition, it's an idea. My blueprint allows me to be flexible and open-minded, so my personal influences, whether spiritual or emotional, and research, whether scientific or empirical, can flow into my work as necessary. These influences and research are crucial to the development of my art. That said, I must remain true to my origins. If I don't create with guardrails, limits on how far I can swerve from my blueprint, breakdowns in my ability to be satisfied with the progression of my work erode my willingness to keep at it. It's hard for me to backpedal. Not in an editorial way, but by having to throw everything in reverse and unwinding changes or mistakes I'm unhappy with. The challenge is for me to get back to a place where the art and blueprint make sense to me again. God forbid I have to start over. I have a sad amount of unfinished creative work floating around uselessly like the Great Pacific garbage pile. So yes, my work does evolve in unexpected ways, but my initial idea and the thoughts and emotions it may convey is a magnet at the center of my work as it pulls all the pieces together. I work hard not to let the idea evolve, just the craft elements around it. I have come to the conclusion over the last few weeks that I am highly unqualified to conclusively address how or why we normalize that which is not normal. I am equally unqualified to address reversing the status quo on what is currently normal but ought not to be. I am no diagnostician. However, I have been thinking this. Not all people, but many, don't appear particularly motivated to uproot and shake the dirt off the status quo, even when it's absurd, chillingly disgraceful, or downright blatantly wrong. In my estimation, indifference and complacency play a crucial role in the social norming of the abnormal. Indifference is easy, and complacency, the long-term acceptance of the way things are, has become routinized in our social acceptances. If people are not more than moderately affected by something, myself included, we are typically unwilling to surrender the bandwidth of our attention to engage, especially when things are structurally enforced by violence and or captivity. Often, there are immense barriers to change. For myself, I have simply grown accustomed to my difficulties. Others, affected by the status quo of violence and dysfunction, and who are deep in the fray of trying to make two ends meet, are exhausted at pushing the boundary to effect change. It's the equivalent of an ant carrying an elephant. I am deeply familiar with my own common practice of perfecting illusions by dressing up the window to sensualize or draping the veil to ignore current realities. I'm also exceptional at creating therapeutic narratives that rationalize and ease the abnormalities I face, or we face, societally. We all know how to keep it simple. Out of sight, out of mind. That has no impact on my life, and that's just the way it is. These are all cop-outs said to dismiss the thought of responsibility of what more must be done to chip away at the status quo. I have invented all sorts of invalid reasons and excuses for me not to engage life, art, or the difficulties of society in a meaningful way. I'm not going to finger point any other culprits than myself. I'm just saying I get it. It's hard. I'm not ashamed to admit that I don't know how to address the social norming of that which is not normal. I have become apathetic, cynical, and fatigued by the elephant carry of my own circumstances. Incarceration, tremendous loss, and a sense of uselessness. In addition, I've become intellectually lazy to the thought of the way things ought to be. I have become a passenger of time and a bystander to my own survival. I have been affected by indolence for the last several years. Part of my affliction is that I crave a life of purpose and meaning beyond the primitive nature of survival. My problem is that it has taken me a dreadfully long time to release my former life, prior to incarceration, and accept a present reality that has appeared to have no necessity of my existence to thrive. I have been stubborn to grow into my new life. It has been an exacting process to come to terms with the fact that there are no resolutions to the traumas that devastate me. Slowly but surely, I have begun to experience the type of incremental growth that allows me to inhabit an artistic space that is different, but not necessarily defiant of the status quo. I have had great luck and good fortune to be part of an organization, Exchange for Change, that has been a catalyst for my creativity to flourish. Prior to E4C, I'd been a rock in a hard place ready for geological study. But now, the potentiality of being an artist, actually having creative output, exists. I still feel like a tormented dilettante, struggling for purpose beyond survival, but I'm growing. To be more succinct in my answer, I did not create the space I inhabit as an artist. What I did do, somewhat begrudgingly, is shake the dirt off my own self-imposed status quo and transplant myself into more hospitable habitat. My new environment gives me permission to accept my life and be passionately creative again.
So, Jason, that's kind of a lot of material that Mike threw out there. I think some of the things that stuck out to me was this idea of complacency, and that he recognizes the impact of becoming complacent, where you can actually grow roots, but that you can also weed out those kinds of invasive plants and thrive. So I wonder, for someone who was where Mike was at the time and where you are now, how you see your own evolution evolve in your artwork.
Mike, you stated my new environment gives me permission to accept my life and be passionately creative again. Your new environment is your headspace, I would posit, because I had to go through all these things. For me, while I was incarcerated, I had to find that headspace to allow me to grow while I was still there. Because without that, I would have just got devolved into a more primal state that I was uncomfortable with. I would also like to hear from you possibly what more hospitable habitat looks like. For me, it reads that you've learned to accept where you are in life and decided to become content there. That's what I went through. I had to become content where I was, where I am currently. And through that, I was able to create born out of the frustration, the incarceration, the trauma that I experienced, and that my location is not physical. My location is a mental state. And once I realized that, I realized I could control my state at all times just by controlling my mental state. And if I find myself in a tough situation, I just look forward to where I want to be, not where I am, and I make plans to move there. Because we can only build or create anything from what we already have, from the tools that we have, from the experiences we have, the trauma that we've experienced, the amazing that we've experienced. And I have all of that. I've got amazing things that have happened in my life before, during, since, now. And I choose to not be defined by my trauma. I choose to utilize my trauma as a tool in my belt that I can build something amazing from. And that allows me to connect to people who've experienced a similar trauma. Back to you, Alma, is your little confined spaces have nothing to do with incarceration, but I feel it. I feel the mentality of the carceral state within your work. And to me, that draws me. The ability to throw a beach in a room under an umbrella, I feel like I'm at the beach, you know? I'm not in that space because you've allowed me to see beyond where I am. When I made my work, The Thin Line, it's a series of almost 100 images now, but when I printed that one image, it's 15 foot long. It's nowhere near the scale and scope. I want it to be something larger than life that you walk up to and you feel like you're there. It's a blurry landscape. I'm driving down the road at 80 miles an hour, trying to get somewhere desperately. But during this journey of going down the road, I find myself missing the journey. I'm so hyper-focused on where I want to be that I don't understand in that moment that I'm already here where I am and I'm headed somewhere that's going to be amazing. So let's enjoy our journey, whether it was in carceral state, whether it's in an educational state, whether it's in an institutional state whatsoever. I have to be aware that I am where I am. I have to be aware that I am where I'm heading. I'm going where I'm heading. And I have to be okay with all of that. And making art for me is taking everything all at once, throwing in a while. This is my process. I kind of throw it out there. I see how it looks, and then I start organizing it to where the message that I want to get will be conveyed by the viewer without my interpretation, introduction, or anything like that. So yeah.
So Alma, Mike had a lot to say there, and one of the things that stood out for me was this idea of complacency, and that if you become too complacent, you grow roots. But we also know that you can pull out the roots of weeds and flourish. So I just wonder, in addition to that initial question I had about accepting the status quo in an imposed environment, how you see that play out in your own work.
I see that for some reason, my work has always had an element of activism. So as much as in the beginning I try to veer away from that, it has turned out to be that way, especially after the military coup in Honduras, like I mentioned before, and then after the Trump election. And the way that immigrants were treated here, the way that children were put in cages and are still being put in cages. So I think that there's no other option really, you know. And for example, for last year, I installed a project at Green Space Miami about what was going on here with the COVID, and the first sort of signs of like what an authoritarian regime is when you start sort of like interfering with information that's supposed to be available to the public. In the case of Governor DeSantis, and now that he's thinking about running for for the presidency, that's something that really, I guess gives me a source of future projects to come that I am already thinking about continue to expand on. Yeah, projects that I'm working on right now, and projects that I think that are very important here as Latinos and as a person of color and as a Central American. I mean, the guy ran on a platform of Build the Wall, so he has always been on my radar. As a person that I definitely want to do work about. Yeah,
Great, thank you.
especially right now.
Yeah, yeah, especially today. Um, that's a great segue into the last question. And that's if we presume that it's a basic instinct for all people to want to be heard, want to be seen, want to be recognized, how is it that we find our voice through this frustration of isolation, particularly coming out of this unprecedented 2-year pandemic? How does art allow us to feel connected and come from the space that you're just talking about, which is this is where you are, this is all a journey? If we believe that art is the conversation that you can listen to through what you observe and see without hearing what the artist has said because they're not there to interpret it for you, how do you as the artist marry the psychological and emotional connections of the mind through the physical representation of your art? Because that is the only thing that the viewer has to go on. So let's hear what Mike has to say about it, and then Alma, maybe you'll respond, and then we'll go back over to Jason.
I didn't realize until I started working on this project how much of my creative life I suppressed under the weight of my incarceration. In much self-reflection and writing, I have come face to face with yet another level of frustration associated with my isolation and loneliness, none of which has been necessarily exacerbated by the pandemic. Life hasn't changed that much because of COVID-19. It's not to say there weren't strenuous circumstances here and there, but prison life, in general, makes isolation and its associated maladies commonplace, regardless of a condition that magnifies it. For me, finding my voice through prison and pandemic, a voice that I trust and recognize, is a constant quarrel within myself. I often undervalue the sound of my own voice. I am unheard and unseen because I, with great frequency, rescind the vast majority of my creative work. I have become a self-defeatist in that way. There is one of Jason's photographs I especially appreciate, the framed documents that are heavily redacted. It's representative of my body of work. I have stricken nearly everything from the record of my creative life. It has been to my own detriment, but also to the collective voice. St. Thomas's words resonate here as well. A part of the aggravation for someone like myself, who has limited access to an array of arts that suit my talents, it's that I'm bound to the environment in which I find myself. Being able to participate or even bear witness to a larger body of artistic expression simply isn't possible. It's stifling. As someone who leans heavily on the natural world, especially coastal habitats, to express and experience art, I'm hemmed in by space and time. It's an unnatural divorce between me and my creative life, forcibly torn apart. Hence, the suppression is a heavy chain that tethers me to a cell of solitude and loneliness, which is already a byproduct of an incarcerated life. It's opportunities like this, being part of a conversation, that sweeps me away from the shadows of obscurity and toward the warming light of being seen, heard, and recognized. This is one of the few ways in which I have felt connected to people through art in a long time. And the bigger picture of how art allows people to feel connected is in its universality. I don't have to speak Japanese to experience the cultural art of Japan. I don't have to be a part of a socioeconomic class to bear witness to poverty or wealth in art. The language of art is not bound by its creator's lifestyle, religion, or culture, even if the influences are apparent. Art can be versatile, inclusive, and envelop a panorama of people.
So, Alma, I think one of the things that Mike really stressed was the universality of art. And he may not speak Japanese, but he can understand the Japanese culture. And what you've done with your own artwork is to take your experiences of Honduras and trauma and put it out there for the world to be able to relate to in their own way. So, could you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, Zelda's in particular was a conversation I was having with Hondurans, with Central Americans initially. And then eventually it expanded. I mean, there are people that come to me and tell me I can really relate, like Jason just mentioned, that work sort of like made an impact in the way like he started to like images of his experience and trauma started to come to mind in the incarceration system, and that is great. So if you can touch people in different ways, even the better. But yeah, initially it was that conversation that I was having with my place, with the home that I left, with my experience of trauma. Yeah, and with that larger narrative and conversation to sort of create a counter archive to the hypervisibility of violence in the country. So yeah. That's why you don't see images of the human body in the spaces. That's why you don't see. That's what I try to relay, all the trauma within the space.
And it's so interesting because then it allows the viewer to figure out where they fit into that space and certain things that will trigger them, whereas other things won't have any sort of impact at all. Yeah. Jason, sorry, go ahead.
No, we already have a lot of that hypervisibility. In the media and television, all that idea that it's exported, and that they have as like these brown bodies, massacre brown bodies, tattoo brown bodies. So I wanted to stay away from that. I wanted to give the perspective from the civilian, from the average Honduran, which I was able to experience after I went back to the country after years of being absent, in 2009. And I felt like I was walking into a macabre Alice in Wonderland. The country that I left when I was 14 years old was no longer the place I encountered. So I produced this piece in Southern Illinois University. I was invited to create this work and to give a talk back in 2015. So I became really interested in making a piece about femicides in San Pedro Sula. Was one of the worst places to be a woman in Central America and in Latin America in general. So I created this piece and brought in images of crime involving sex workers. And then I became really interested in humanizing the women, like you see the piece of cloth with embroidery, with the high heels, and then solo para mujeres, for women only. On the rocking chair, I thought that would be really interesting to create this metaphor like that would make the viewer think that these were human beings, that they had family members waiting for them at home too, that they had loved ones. And then I sort of collapsed here in a more, I think this is where my work started to sort of like evolve in the visual aspect of it, where I actually brought in an image of a crime site in the space with a painting. That is actually the neighborhood where I grew up in San Pedro Sula. It's called Medina Concepcion. It's like the marketplace there. And now it's a no man's land. And so and then like the red bulb, like sort of like a metaphor for like the red square and stuff like that. So yeah, there was a lot of symbolism that I brought in the work. And
great, thank you. It's interesting. I saw that single light, and I had a different idea. I thought that in all of this darkness, there's still this spot of hope where there's some illumination, that there could be change. So interesting way of interpretation.
I usually. That's very interesting because I usually bring the light bulb in the spaces, and yes, a lot of people have told me that it reminds them of that home.
Yeah, of course, and Jason, who is very familiar with a prison cell and a single light, always looking for ways to illuminate what can be a rather isolated and dark situation. Maybe finish up with a comment on all of this.
Yeah, I want to be seen, heard, recognized, acknowledged, all of those things. It's frustrating to try and throw stuff out to the world, and even my neighbor or the person sitting across from me and them not understanding me properly. It's okay to have two different languages. It's okay to communicate differently than other people. And it's okay to just put stuff out there. With this series, with this piece, Compulsion, it's a collection of jars stuffed with things that I disassembled, stuff that people threw away. At one point was valuable, as were we all at one point, and we all are still. We just don't see the value in ourselves. So all this stuff at one point was top shelf, top of the line, best of the best possibly. And it was relegated as insignificant by somebody because it no longer served a purpose. I've given new life to all of this, and I've repurposed all of this junk into something, into collections and jars, because that's how we make sense of life. We make sense by organizing, sorting, filtering, and elevating some things higher and relegating things lower. So I've created in Compulsions a case system that makes sense of how I organize my life, how I organize you in this one space. You go over here on this shelf because maybe I'm going to use you later down the road. You go up here because you represent me or my son, and that is the ultimate goal of where I want to attain. Over here on the side is a side node. It's a shadow of what I once was and how I'm crawling out to become. That's the little character crawling out on the left-hand side. Maybe in the middle, like all those little resistors and transistors and little wires, all those once powered something that was great and helped you do something even better. There's film canisters in the back to kind of record the life that it lived. So all these things, they build together and tell a story, a dialogue. The empty jars are what can be when you just start to fill them. So this is the first steps of me building a community around myself. It's a physical manifestation. When you see it, it's a shadow of another piece that's there. That is the workbench. And in the workbench is just all of the trash in its various states of decompositions, ready to go into even more jars. It's the cameras, it's the lenses, it's the brokenness. And in some case, in this piece here, I reassembled broken cameras to just create a structure of nothingness, to give you a sense that all these things still exist, and no matter how broken they are, they're still there. I am still here as a broken person, but my experience drives my future. And I think question is my basic instinct to want to be seen. Yes, I want you to understand where I came from. I don't want that to define who I am today, because I'm on a trajectory that's not my past, but it is born of that.
Jason, thank you so much for that. That seems like a really great way to bring this to conclusion. And I hope that those of you who are watching this, who are listening to this, have your own new sense of order, looking at art and your environment and your space with a new lens, giving new light to the perspective of the artists. Alma, Jason, and Mike, thank you so much. And a particularly huge thanks to the Green Family Foundation and Green Space for allowing this to happen, and for our technical support from the Miami Book Fair. We're going to turn it back to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you all. If I can, summarize a bit of what we talked about, we've discussed points that I think lead us in the direction of the words of Caterina Gregos, who says that social inequalities produced by confinement is sizable and enduring. Systems of confinement found from migration to immigration detention to youth and mass incarceration. Systems that can and do lead to physical, emotional, spiritual, and soulful confinement. But yet through that, we've borne witness, we've been enlightened to the justice work that has been done through the creative process and expression. And we know that there is no blind justice. To be just, we have to look. And while some of us might look away from the news, most of us won't avert our eyes from art. So let us look. Let us recognize and look to art as the language of liberation, as a step in the healing process, as a tool of self-reflection, self-assurance, self-advocacy. Let us look to art as an ever-growing library of truth, where those from the outer fields and everywhere in between will not be left for forgotten, will not be left unheard, and where people's humanity leads and connects. And I'd like to close with a line from one of Alma's poems, which is titled From the Fields and Everywhere in Between, wherein she says, I die with the sunset, I'm born with the sunrise, once again and once more after that. So thank you, Alma, Mike, Jason, and Kathie for gathering us today to rise again, but to do so together. Thank you all for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, and the work that your hearts and minds have molded into being today. As always, we like to end it by continuing to highlight the phenomenal work that is being done by the individuals in our community. And so our last slide will have their websites where you can look into upcoming programming, exhibitions, discussions, volunteer opportunities. And if you'd like to hear more from us here at Green Space, see what we're doing, connect deeper with these individual leaders and artists in our community, look us up on Instagram, look us up on Facebook, just follow that Green G. We can't wait to see you at our next Artist Talk. So again, thank you all for being here today. Thank you to our moderator, to our speakers, to these creatives. You are doing the true work. And so we are so grateful to just be a part of that. Everybody have a great day.